Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Dianne Hartshorn.
This is part 2 of our chat with Jared Richman and our discussion on Mary Shelley and her book Frankenstein.
But then when her second Vindications is then published in 92, it really does eclipse that first one. No one was really reading that as much because there were so many responses to it.
Right.
She weighs in. I mean, she is not shy at all. And I think Mary Shelley really does inherit her mother's impetus to do that, to be outspoken and have a voice. It's really just a remarkable thing.
Well, and even later, and you can see that later when Mary Shelley, so after Percy dies and she goes in to edit his works, and they had especially towards the end, their relationship was rough because of losing their children. They had children who died. They had 3 of their 4 children died very, very young, which had a huge impact on Mary herself. And I know it did on Percy too. Like he was feeling it too, but just their grieving processes were different from each other. So by the time he died, they still loved each other. They completely did, but Mary had made herself, I think, more distant from Percy for a while in her own grief, which is totally understandable. But after he died, she really wanted people to remember him very fondly the way she did. And so she worked really hard to edit his works and also be honest about him, though. I mean, there were things that she did edit out, I think, but there was a lot of things that she's like, nope, this is who he was. And and it was the reason Percy's father, who was part of the British aristocracy, really didn't want her putting that work out there, because he had been kind of ashamed of his son for years at this point, after the failure of the first marriage and, running away with herself with Mary and all of these little things. But she did a really good job, I think, of bringing to light who Percy Shelley was. And we know more now, things that she left out that we found out since then as historians. But I really think for her, it was important to make sure that people knew who he was and the profound influence that he had on her, in addition to her parents and some of the other people that she had in her life. And I do think for her later works, that really did shape how she wrote other things besides Frankenstein.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, Percy's legacy is wholly contingent and indebted to Mary's efforts. I mean, the works that some of the ones that he's most famous for, his 1819 treatise on called A Defense of Poetry, is it's a manifesto about the sort of political importance of poetry, and that would never have been published if it weren't for Mary's efforts as an editor. It's a remarkable thing. And he is disinherited. There's an agreement with the family, and then after he dies, and the title is then inherited by their only surviving son.
Right.
Florence inherits the title, but and that actually helps out with Mary eventually, because she's, here's the other thing about being an author in the 18th and the 19th century, especially for women. These women are writing to make money, because there's not a lot of ways to make money as a woman, or at least not legitimate ways, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something her mother struggled with too. And her mother, in addition to trying to care for herself, and then later Fanny, when she had Fanny, she was also trying to care for her own sisters from growing up, because she had several sisters who she helped secure jobs as governesses and other things like that for, who I always I was finding it funny how the relationship between her and her sisters, because she was the oldest of the girls, the Wollstonecraft girls, and they always I feel like they really heavily relied on her for their own lives. And here's this woman who's writing about why it's important for women to speak up and have an education, have their own voices, do their own thing. And yet her sisters are like, we want you to do all of this for us, because we don't want to actually put the effort in to support ourselves. So we want, and of course, as she became more well-known, they were like, well, you should have money, even though a lot of times she didn't, because the money just wasn't there for.
It's true. Yeah.
For writers in general, not just women, but for writers in general, they might have been famous, but they weren't usually wealthy because of their writings.
When she dies, she's become a kind of pariah. It's such like Godwin was so distraught, he didn't even go to the funeral. I mean, it was,
I know.
it was such a sad, sad affair. But I mean, she was absolutely vilified by the conservative press. And there was a there was a publication that used to come out in the late 1790s, was like a journal, like a magazine called the Anti-Jacobin.
Hmm.
And, Jacobin was the sort of like conservative or the Tory name for like radicals because of the French Jacobin, like the kind of it's like nowadays you see it, terms get tossed around. It doesn't really mean the thing it actually means, but it was a kind of a catch-all term for like English radical who was
Right.
against monarchy and so forth. So when the anti-Jacobin comes out, I want to say it's like the year that Wollstonecraft dies. They have a kind of collected edition of all of the issues that come out, and there's an index. And when you look in the index under Wollstonecraft, it says "see prostitute." I mean,
Hmm.
it's just devastating. I
Oh,
know, it's shocking. So she really was culturally made into this kind of pariah. And then Godwin, when he writes his memoirs, he tries to sort of resurrect her legacy and her memory. Kind of makes it worse because he talks
Yeah.
a lot of different affairs and her daughter out of wedlock. And it's just, I'm telling you, it was not an easy life for Mary Wollstonecraft. And that's the world into which Mary Shelley is born,
Yeah.
right? And so she's sort of like early on, her life is like defined by these old books and dead people, her dead mother. And I mean,
Hmm.
her life is sort of begins in a way out of the grave. I mean, it's just the way it is. And then it explains a lot why she's so obsessed with life and death and birth. And then later on, disease even becomes a topic of her work.
Yeah. Well, and one of the ones that, they, and things that they were discussing when they were with Byron and Percy and all of them together, that was the time when you had like the writings of Erasmus Darwin coming out and the ideas of creationism going beyond the biblical version that they'd all been taught. And of course, Percy himself was, very anti-religion, and he is an atheist, which was so shocking at the time. And it really, I mean, it did create issues for them when he would write that down and stuff, but that he was an atheist. Um, and so I know that also led to a lot of what she would write about, because there were these concepts that science hadn't quite caught up with, but like the ideas were there and they were just coming out. And in fact, in our script, Victor does quote Erasmus Darwin on purpose, which for our listeners who aren't familiar with him, he is the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who is the one who became really famous for his ideas on creation. But um, it, I I went and read Erasmus's poem that he wrote, the big, long, long poem, and that I can't think of the title of it now. But
The Botanic Garden, or the
yes,
love of the plants, and yeah.
yeah, and I did pull a part of the poem out for Victor to quote, because I was like, the poem was fascinating, super long. It always
It,
cracks me up how long some of the poems were for these classic poets. Like they were books long. They weren't just like,
right.
we think of poetry now, it's like a page, and these are like on and on. I mean, it's like Dante's Inferno and some of the other stuff that was published at the time, where it's just so much of it. But I did go back and read that one after reading some of the other stuff, because I was more curious about Erasmus, because I mean, I knew the name, but I didn't know him, because everybody knows Charles Darwin.
well known in the period. He was a physician, and he did write. So this is the thing too about this period, is that you have these people that they dabble in so many different areas,
Yes.
right? They're doing literature and they're doing science and they're interested in in on the stage, and they're interested in technology, and the same kind of disciplinary boundaries that we see now just don't operate in the same ways. In fact, one of Percy's best friends is this guy Humphrey Davy, who's the like father of modern chemistry. And they, of course, and Mary knew him well, and he wrote poetry, and they went to see him do experiments. And, some of the experiments that she may have seen, in London in the time is when there was a theory called a galvanism,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of shapes, right, Frankenstein, which has to do with the idea that there's that sort of biological bodies can actually produce electricity, and then the
Right.
reverse, that you can manipulate biological bodies with electricity. And we know that sort of Percy and Mary saw these kind of, there'd be like experiments as like a show. So you would go and
Yeah.
see these things in London, and and they would sort of have a dead frog, and they would add an electrical charge to the frog's legs, and the frog's leg would move, and it's amazing thing. And so it's not a huge leap, right? To move from these ideas and then see how Shelley adapts it into Frankenstein. She's really interested in that relationship and all of the excitement around these kind of new scientific ideas and technologies that are, it's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Like there's just a lot happening. There's so much going on. It's
And as a
exciting.
woman, to be surrounded by those circles of men who accepted her, I don't, as an equal instead of, in what would probably be a traditional marriage, and that she would not have been exposed to any of that, which that is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, it's tragic too. I mean, Mary and Percy, they elope, right? They sort of leave England in 1814. And then, like Percy's still married. He has a couple of children with Harriet Westbrook, Harriet Shelley. And then, of course, I mean, it's kind of sad, but she commits suicide.
Mm.
She throws herself into the Serpentine in Hyde Park. And, it's kind of a rough thing, but it's something like that same month, like after Harriet dies, like Mary and Percy get married and make it official. But
Yeah.
there's just suicide like surrounds. Mary's older, her half sister Fanny commits suicide shortly before that. Like there's just, and as like Jennie said, she sort of loses all but one of her children. It's
Mhm.
you can't even imagine the kind of trauma that she's endured from the beginning of her life, and then all the way through.
Yeah, because she outlives so many of the people that she was surrounded by, either because they died of accidents, natural causes, or the suicide. And actually, both Harriet and Fanny's suicides really affected Mary Shelley. And she felt some guilt
Yeah,
for
of
both
course.
of them because the reason Harriet committed suicide was because of her eventual divorce and separation
Yeah.
from Percy, and also the fact that he was trying to get their children, and all that she was going through a lot. And again, as a woman, she was struggling with the recourse to fight Percy on all of this. And then Fanny Fanny was not the intellectual that Mary was. But I do love the fact that if we go back to it, so when Mary Wollstonecraft died, Fanny was about 3 years old, and then Mary Shelley came along. So she was the big sister. I love that Godwin kept Fanny as his daughter and
Hmm.
continued to raise her as his daughter in addition to Mary, because he didn't have to do that, but he
No,
chose to, and he still raised her. But she definitely was not the intellectual that her younger sister was. And I think she was in that shadow her whole life, and the fact that she was known to be an illegitimate child, that probably affected her as a young woman, going out and trying to have a relationships and moving forward. But
As
I
people
do think Mary
talk in
Shelley felt
circles.
a lot of guilt when Fanny
Yeah.
committed suicide for that reason.
and all that happens, around the time that she's working on Frankenstein. This
Mm-hmm.
is autumn and the winter of 1816, and these things happen, and it's just you can't even imagine. And I think she's pregnant at the time with
Yep.
Clara. Guys, I mean, it's one of those things. This is the other thing too. I think, Jennie, like you had said earlier, yeah, obviously Percy was dealing with the same types of trauma and the loss of their children, but you know, it's got to be different for the woman that carries the child, and it's very embodied, is what we say, right? And
Right.
so that's what's another thing that really comes through in Frankenstein is the way in which she's sort of troubling over and is anxious about the body, right? And what it
Mm-hmm.
means to sort of, obviously in this case, right, create life not through the female line, right? Not through the kind of female body. And which is this abomination against God, right? Creating a life, right? Not through the sort of so-called natural ways. And
Mhm.
so, but she must have been thinking about what's her phrase? Like the exam, I think Victor says to examine the course of life, one must first have recourse to death. And you got to
Mhm.
think in her own body. She's thinking about that, not just because of her own children, but because of the way that she was born, the circumstances of her own birth. And
Yeah.
so that just makes the novel. That's why, like, I think, my students all often comment on the fact that it seems like such a boys' novel because it's almost all
Right.
male characters, right?
Right.
And I try and remind them, like, yeah, but it's framed by all
Yeah.
of these women and these important, female characters. So,
There's a moment that when I was writing Victor's part of the script where he has that reflection on life and death. Because, initially he's so excited about the idea of creating life and what this character, he's going to create all these beings that are going to love him because he's their creator. And he goes through that whole thing. And then later he's reflecting on the fact that he didn't think about what has to go beyond just creating that body. Like there's a soul attached to this creature, right?
Mhm.
And he didn't think that through when he was initially like, I'm just going to create life and they're going to revere me because these new species exist. And then of course he's completely disgusted by his creation once he actually brings it to life. He's like, what did I just do? And he runs
And he
away from
abandons
it. And
him. Yeah.
he spends his
yes, he
that
does.
time going through it. And he has this reflection, or at least, and it's not quite what he says in the book, but it's close to it, where he's like, I didn't give it the thought that it had to go beyond just animating a body. Like there's more to life than that. And he didn't think that through initially. And it doesn't happen till later, till after he's had conversations with the monster, that he's like, yeah, that was my bad.
Yeah, because
Like I should have put a little more thought behind that. But it
he
also shows the excitement of the time of science at the time
yeah.
and how we were really starting to make strides into what is science and how do we form hypothesis and how do we put all this together. And the thing I love even more, and I've said this for a long time now, is it does show you how as education was becoming more integral into society, not just for men, but also for women, but for everybody in general, for a long time, it was the upper class
Mhm.
who were educated, really educated. Or, if you worked for the church, you got an education, things like that. But other than that, the rest of the world, not really educated. But it shows how science and literature and the arts and math all work together. And that if you leave one out, you leave out a lot of really important details to forming like an entire education and a whole human. And her book encompasses a lot of that without even realizing it till later when you think about it a lot later about how you need the arts and you need science and you need
Mhm.
math all together, even if you're not, I was never great at science or math. That wasn't my forte. And I groaned about taking those classes both in high school and college where I was like, oh man, but I understand what makes how it all works together. And this is going on a whole different tangent of me going when I see like especially public schools taking the arts out of the public schools and stuff. I'm like, we lose
So
what it
much.
really means to have an education and if we don't have all of this
Yeah.
together because it all works together.
I
So
think what was so sad for me was Victor created the monster that didn't want to be created, and then he abandoned him.
Yeah.
Well, this novel is, I mean, I like to say it's sort of a novel that takes on almost everything. I mean, it's a novel about, of course, life and death, about technology, about medicine, about science, but it's also a novel about education. It's really anxious about sort of modes and kind of tracks of education and the sort of it's kind of the now defunct binary between sort of nature and nurture.
Right.
But the creature's first experience, right, as Dianne says, is one of abandonment, right? The creature, he's whatever animated or born. I always ask my students, like, is this a birth scene? And then the first thing that Victor does is he like runs away
Yeah.
from his creation, his child. So that moment of abandonment, Diane, is like so important, to think about. Is that what then sort of sets the creature on this path to becoming a murderer and to becoming, this kind of what he says, a wretched figure? It's just it does. I think about it. There's a kind of novel that gets sort of that's very popular in this era. It comes out of the German tradition. It's called the Bildungsroman. It's a novel of education, right? Novel of youth. And there is a way to read Frankenstein in that way, not only of the creatures kind of creation and then education, but also of Victor's too, because we learn a lot about Victor. My students are always kind of shocked to like think about this, but he's a college student. Victor is like a college
Yep.
student.
He's young. Yeah.
Right? He leaves Geneva and he goes, he's like, oh, I got really, interested in this stuff. And he's like, he just decides to go off and do his own research. But he's basically a college student,
I mean, he's influenced by his professors, when he's talking
well,
about.
you have a lot of responsibility for that, Jennie.
Yeah. No, but well, like I said, Victor talks about, I've been talking to this professor and I've been learning all these things and all these other men of science that he's come in contact with, right? That excites him, and that's what gets him to go off. But yes, he's a college student. He's
really
20-something years
they're all
old.
young. They're all young if you think about it.
They are. Well, and then his friend Henry Clerval, who's interested in languages, and then Elizabeth, who loves poetry. And there in that kind of triad, to go back to something that Jennie had said earlier, is kind of like a liberal arts model of learning, where you have all of these disciplines. And when you're missing an aspect of it, there's this, the idea. I mean, this is why the novel is called the Modern Prometheus, right? The subtitle has to do with the Promethean myth, right? There's two halves to that, right? So like Prometheus, the more common understanding of that myth, right, is that he takes fire and he then gives it to humanity, right? Because he feels bad for them, right? He steals fire. And that, fire is a sort of, right, whatever, symbol or metaphor for her learning and technology and science. But the other half of the Promethean myth is that he actually creates human beings out of clay. Because what is Frankenstein? It's a creation myth, right? Like Paradise Lost, which the creature reads, and like the Bible, right? I mean, that's the one thing missing. I always ask myself, like, well, what's missing in this novel? And they're like, I don't know, it has a lot of stuff. And then they're like, religion. There's like no religion in the novel. Like, yeah, at least not overtly, right? Victor he never goes to church. He never has these discussions about, what he should do. Paradise Lost is about as close as you can get, right?
Probably, yeah.
The creature says, I should be thy Adam, like he says to Victor, right? But then in the end, he sort of identifies more with Satan and with Eve, actually. But he's not really Adam, right? He can't be, the Adam, because his creator really doesn't love him, because he gets abandoned, as Dianne said.
Yes.
Well, I was wondering too, if in that time period, illegitimate children it may have been scorned upon, but it didn't stop them from having illegitimate children.
Oh, no.
And so I'm wondering if how many of those illegitimate children were abandoned, and they just saw that within their circle of friends too. And then maybe that was Mary's way of seeing how these children may come back to, I don't want to say haunt.
Yes.
The father that abandoned them.
Well, it is, I think, I would say about that two things, Dan. Like, first of all, it's very common, right? There's a lot of, sometimes they're called bastards, other times they're called foundlings, other times they're called the so-called natural children, right? They're not claimed by, it's usually, oftentimes an upper class man who has an affair with a lower class woman or something. This happens all the time. And usually the kind of responsibility that falls on the parish, right? On like charity and stuff. But I love that term that you used, Dianne, because it is a little bit about haunting. I mean, that is the central sort of trope of the Gothic it has an element of the supernatural, but there's something that's haunting. And it's usually someone's past is coming back.
He's shadow. Yeah.
That's
the month's
shadows. And you see that all throughout Gothic literature, which begins really in England in the 1860s and goes all the way through the 19th century. But that kind of haunting, right? Oh my God, I did something, and that's Frankenstein, right? The creature comes back, and then he kills all of Victor's family. Sorry if I'm spoiling it.
No, you can spoil it. I mean, the book's been out for a long time, so
if people haven't read it,
the monster does commit several murders throughout the book.
He does. Sorry, spoilers.
A lot of that has to do with the fact that he's so frustrated by the, he does make that denounce, or he announces at one point, he's like, man is now my enemy because they continually don't accept me. They continually, shun me. And so why should I care anymore? And he literally makes that declaration. And so that's why we end up seeing, although a couple of the murders I think are accidental. Like, I'll take that back. One of the murders to me is accidental. And that is William in the beginning. He's just trying to get the little boy not to scream at him anymore, accidentally chokes him to death. But because he's so strong. And that's one of the things that, Victor talks about when he was creating his monster. He made it bigger. He made him a bigger than a normal sized man a little bit. And he's strong and he has this muscle. But I also find it interesting that until he brings him to life, he doesn't think of him as grotesque or ugly. Right. Victor describes in his own words that he was trying to create something beautiful. Like, and he wanted that he didn't want his monster to be this horrible, ugly thing. He wanted this thing of beauty, and it didn't work. And that was part of the reason he himself ran away from it. But I think people, and again, because of the way the monster has been portrayed later on stage and in movies and stuff, he's not portrayed as possibly having been beautiful, but he should have been. That's the thing, is he really should have been this beautiful. He
says that he selects all the parts, right? He's had really hair and, like pearly white teeth. But, Victor says, like, I dabble among the unhallowed damps of the grave. Like when you go grave robbing, which was not an uncommon phenomenon in this period. This is how medical students actually got their cadavers that they would work on. And oftentimes, early on, a lot of these bodies are convicts. They would be taken. There's so many stories of grave robbing, even in the early 18th century, but especially it becomes almost an industry by the time Shelley's writing in the early 19th century. But if you're taking the body parts from the grave, also, too, I don't know if most people don't notice this. He says that he hangs out in the like night vaults and the charnel houses, right? He also goes to the slaughterhouse. Means that some of the creature's parts might be animal parts. That's the kind of suggestion, because as you were saying, Jennie, he can survive in these really, really difficult conditions, right? He can hang out in the extreme cold, right? He goes to the Arctic, he's up in the Alps, and he says that he's going to go and take after Victor creates him a companion, they're going to then head to, he says, the wilds of South America. So he can handle these extreme conditions in ways that whatever humans can't. So he may be more than human. He may be superhuman.
A little bit, yeah. I was trying to look for my spot in the script where he talks, where I wrote about it, because I was just going through it. Yeah, because he says in the book, he says about it, it's beautiful hair and teeth contrasted horribly with its watery eyes, shriveled skin, and black lips. So you think, like you said, he was pulling body parts from dead things that have already started to decay. And then when he brings it back to life, it's like going back to the frog. The frog moved. The frog's legs jumped because they had the electricity. This is before they were embalming and doing things like that. So when you put that all together, it does become very grotesque in mind.
You have a lovely monster.
But what's weird is that Shelley, and this is before, but she's kind of into this stuff. I mean, again, for someone that sort of hangs out in her mother's graveyard and then, whatever, spends time with her lover in the graveyard. And then, when Shelley dies in 1822, that, they're living in Italy. Do you know the story? Do you know how Shelley died? Her husband died.
It was super tragic.
Yeah, he's sailing on a ship. He has his boat called, the Ariel, and there's a storm, and the ship goes down, and he dies. And so, because of Italian law, anything that then washes up onto shore has to be burned.
Yeah.
So when this happens, Mary, and then Lord Byron is there, and Edward Trelawney, one of their friends.
That's who I was trying to think of, the other guy.
Yeah. They're on the beach when Shelley's corpse is brought and it's burned. And the story is, this is, who knows, it's apocryphal, but the story is that when they burned Percy Shelley's body, everything burned except for his heart. And the
Yeah.
heart was then taken out. And it said that she kept it, but we didn't know for sure. But when Mary dies, in 1851, she had requested that she be buried with her parents, who were buried in St. Pancras Church, in London. But her son and her daughter-in-law, Jane, they decide instead, what they did was they brought Godwin and Wollstonecraft. They exhumed their remains and they brought them down to Bournemouth to
Yeah.
St. Peter's Church, and they're buried in the churchyard, and that's where they buried Mary Shelley. A year after Mary died, they went through some of her things, and they found her writing box, and they opened up the writing box, and inside the writing box, they found hair of her dead children,
Common.
not well, I guess, a notebook that she and Percy had shared and had written in together. But then they also found a copy of one of Shelley's poems called Adonais. It's a pastoral elegy that was written about the death of John Keats, actually. It's a really wonderful poem. And one of the leaves of the poem is wrapped around a silk satchel, and inside the satchel are some of the ashes of Percy's remains and his heart.
Yep.
She kept his heart on her desk the entire time until she died in 1851. I mean, come on.
Well, and the story of how she even got, because initially she didn't take the heart, is what they
No.
said. Initially, it was Trelawney who took the heart, and I feel like he had a crush on Percy, and he definitely, if you read anything about Trelawney, he was a character, that's for sure. But the heart, according to him, was kind of used as, because he didn't like Mary by the time Percy died. He really he didn't think she was a good wife to him, and that Percy deserved way better than Mary Shelley. But the whole story of that heart and where it went from the time it left the fire to all these people who it passed through to finally coming to Mary Shelley at the end is crazy.
I mean, but these kind of, but it's a relic, right? It's a sort of literary relic. But these were very, very popular. Keats writes a whole poem about how he saw a lock of John Milton's hair that had been manipulated. We're not really sure it was Milton's, but all of these things, it's what Thomas Hardy calls churchyard furniture, like bones and stuff, these relics that become, people just keep them. They just have them. And this is what grave robbers do. And, there's human remains that are being displayed in museums at the time. The Hunter brothers have this
churches.
Church, of course, right? Especially Catholic churches all have relics.
They all have their saints remains and stuff.
It's quite a thing. Yeah, there's a whole story about, there's a writer, 18th century writer named Lawrence Sterne. His skull has a whole journey after death, and then it gets reunited with him later on. So it's not that unusual, but I think for Shelley, it fits because she so interested in the body and interested in remains and just, I mean, in a way, obsessed with graves and death. I mean, this was just an aspect of her writing life, but also of her domestic life, frankly.
I can't imagine being Percy Shelley Jr., the son, and finding that particular artifact. Like if he didn't know she had it, and then he's like going through her belongings and kind of just like, well, this is my father's heart.
But it would be so dried. It would be so dried and so shriveled.
Yeah.
The chances are of them actually looking like a heart or probably be slim to none. They just probably knew what it was, knowing the story.
But they operate in the same way. I mean, the fact that it was wrapped in one of his poems is, I think, really apt in a way, or especially because it was an elegy. It was an elegy about when he died. And there's something about, I mean, there is this, especially for Mary, this kind of closeness between old books, right? Her mother's books, and then of course the sort of the elements of the body. It's just an aspect of her history and her culture. I don't bemoan her that. I think it's cool.
Oh no, it fits. It totally fits. And for her, it would have been a very romantic idea that, and romance as weird as it sounds, romance was a big part of her life in various ways. So I think it's very fitting and it's a great way to end it. But she, like I said, she was a fascinating woman. Her mother was a fascinating woman. And the two, you really can't talk about one without the other sometimes, because even though she didn't know her mom growing up, she knew her mother because of Godwin, because of her writings. And that did really influence who she became as a woman later in her life. So I am super, super happy we chose Frankenstein. I mean, I was excited about it last year when we said we were going to do it this year, but even more so after I finally read it and I started learning about, all the people involved in Mary Shelley's life and wanting to, as I was reading stuff, I was like, I wish I could be in that room, in the drawing room at her father's house when people would come and they'd have these dinners and Johnson's dinner parties when I was like, the moments in history that took place that for them were fairly commonplace, but you think about it now from the historical perspective and you're like, oh my gosh, all these people. I was very fortunate in high school. I went to Italy and we were in Venice, and I cannot think of the name of the coffee shop now, but we had to choose between going on the gondola ride or going to this particular coffee shop that has been in Venice for a very, very, very long time. And I went to the coffee shop, and that's where I had my first real taste of espresso. But also, it was a coffee shop that Lord Byron apparently went to on a very regular basis. Like, he was there all the time. And to sit in the same coffee shop where I knew Lord Byron had been, and he'd been flirting with all the women and having all his trysts in this coffee shop was just like, in that moment for me to be in that space. And I was 17 years old at the time. And now it means even more now that I've read more about him and her and their whole life together and how they all intertwined. So to know that they were sitting in those rooms with those people and all the stuff that came out of those brains.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It makes Frankenstein that much better. The book, I should say. But well, Jared, thank you so much for taking time this morning to join us. This was
so much fun.
Yes,
so much fun.
It's a pleasure. It's so much fun. And I'm so delighted. And listen, it doesn't really take a lot to get me to talk about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley. So,
well, your class coming up, they're in for such a treat. For any of them that may not, I did ask when I was talking to some of our high school students the other day, I'd asked if any of them had actually read the book. And I think 3 of them said they had actually read the book. So I was excited about that because hopefully that will give them more emphasis on what they're doing in their roles. In this show. But I was impressed because I don't think Frankenstein is on the high school literature lists. But I didn't get any of the Gothic novels when I was in high school that we read now.
I read my daughter's book that she had in high school.
Did she?
Hopefully then that's.
I read other good literature in high school. I'm not saying I didn't get good literature. I'm just saying I don't remember those
Frankenstein
being on there. So I was excited that some of our high school students who are participating in the event have actually read the book. And so it will make it a lot of fun. But so yes, your class coming up, you guys are in for such a treat. And the fact that you're so passionate about her and her books and the stories, they're just going to have the best education on Frankenstein and Mary Shelley. I need to like I said, I did send that email to your whole department. And as I was reading everybody's bios in your department and who's written what and I was like, oh, I need to get this book and this book and this book. So my TBR got way longer, and some of the poetry and stuff that was in there, I was like, I have a lot more to read just to educate myself even more based on what you guys are teaching at Colorado College. So
wonderful.
I know, I'm excited, and it makes me want to go back to school.
Yeah,
always welcome. You can come and hang out at my class next week. No problem.
I was going to ask you, can somebody sit in your class?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Jared. Have a lovely day. And folks, for those of you coming to the event this weekend, we are so excited to have you. It's going to be a great show. And thank you too for those of you who are coming, because that means you bought tickets and you're helping to support our preservation efforts at Evergreen Cemetery and Fairview Cemetery. We do both cemeteries there in Colorado Springs, which are the historic cemeteries where there are so many fabulous stories buried. Actually, and I need to share it on our social media because I saw that you put it on the Evergreen Heritage stuff about the doctors that are buried
Yes,
at
there's a
Evergreen?
tour. Yeah, there's a tour this weekend. I'm sorry. This
There
cut
was a
out.
tour that just
This-
happened that
Right,
was
that just
all about the
happened.
doctors. Did that tour, I was going to ask you because we covered it on the podcast a year or two ago. Did that include those lady doctors?
It will include the lady doctors and as well as some of the male doctors as well. So it's an overview of many of the early doctors that are buried at Evergreen
Yes.
Cemetery.
So, well, I'll try and put some information. If you have any pictures from the tour,
Okay.
We'll share those so you guys can check that out. But Evergreen Cemetery has a lot of doctors actually buried there that were very influential on the West at the time.
And we're finding, excuse the pun, we are digging up more and more stories all the time of people we didn't know who were there, whose stories haven't been told, and whose stories desperately need to be told. It's amazing who came to our community back in the day. And of course, as a teacher at CC, Jared is familiar with the influence of the people who came to Colorado Springs.
Yeah, it's crazy. So anyway, thank you guys, and we will see you next week.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really helps makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Dianne and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.